how do I encourage a person in the pain they're going through without making light of the pain they're going through? And anytime a person feels like you're making light of it, the great expression is, well, everything happens for a reason. Why don't we just say everything happens? In our world, it does. The good news is we're not left alone in it, and God is at work in the midst of it, and He's going to get us through it. Like, all those things are true. That doesn't mean that He's got a hidden agenda behind all of this that was all part of His plan.
Welcome to the Calvary Assembly podcast. We are so grateful that you guys are here, where we try to have difficult conversations through a biblical lens. We don't claim to get it all right, but we try to break down scripture in a way that can be helpful for you in understanding God more deeply, to have a better relationship with Him. And so today we are going to be talking about Joseph. Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat is Hollywood or whatever that plays. What is it? What am I looking for?
It's a musical.
Thank you.
Is it a musical?
It is.
I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah. That was the word I was looking for. Thank you. That was a poor intro, but it is a great and interesting story in Scripture of an incredible forgiveness. But there's some real tensions that arise in the story. And so breaking down the story real quick, and you guys I know are going to break it down even further, but Joseph gets sold by his brothers into slavery. He goes through incredible hardships and eventually gets into a position of extreme power and is in a position where his brothers are now begging him. And so he has the authority to either bless them or curse them and cause all sorts of cause harm back to them. And he chooses the high road and the gracious road. And so, but part of what gets brought up in that story is this tension of, actually, this is from Genesis 50, verse 20. It says, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." And so we have this tension where it's like God meant it for good, the enemy meant it for evil, but then it's like, did God actually kind of cause all this harm to His created being? Because that seems like a twisted God to me. And so I'm wondering what you make of this whole conversation in this verse in Genesis 50, verse 20.
Yeah, the biggest question is, did God cause all of these things happen just so He could create some good thing to come at the end of it? And not just for this story. That's a real question in all of our lives. Is the bad thing that's happening to me caused by God so that some secret or mysterious good can come out of it? And I would say no. I don't think that God does things to hurt people just so that He can make good come out of it. I think there's a difference there. And so I think that in the biblical story, it's okay to admit that bad things happen because of brokenness, because of the curse of sin, and it kind of ends there. Now, God can redeem things out of it, and I think we're going to discuss that today. But I think we should first rest in that the bad things happen because of people's choices of destructive ways, and that's not God's intention.
It's just a result of a sinful, broken world that we live in.
Sure, and that could be passive, like our world is kind of cursed by sin, but also in this story, it's also like active because the brothers have chosen to act in destructive ways. But God was not, I don't think God was manipulating or pulling their strings to make them do that decision. And like they didn't have a choice in the matter. I think that they made that decision. The brokenness happened and ensued, but God was able to utilize that so that his goodness and blessings could come to Joseph and his family.
Yeah. I mean, originally their plan was to kill their brother. And they've got him in a pit while they're thinking about how to go about this. And they're actually eating. They're having a meal while their brother's in a pit and crying out because he wants to be rescued and he's terrified. And they come up with the idea that to kill him, there's no profit in it for us. But if we sell him as a slave, then we can all get something out of this. And so what Joseph says, and what I think he reveals about God, he tells his brothers, you intended this. He did not say, God caused you to do this. He holds them accountable for their intentions and for their actions. He doesn't let them off the hook on that. What he does say is, you intended it for harm and for evil, God intended something for good. And so in the human intention, as much as it is to try to destroy, God can actually redeem whatever we throw at him. And he's actually to bring something good out of it. I do understand that in Christianity, there are people who believe that God programmed all of this. They really had no choice but to do what they did to Joseph because God had a plan. What I think about that is God didn't cause them to betray their brother and to sell him into slavery. I think what God did is his purpose was not thwarted when they acted that way, and he could work redemptively to still accomplish his purpose regardless of what they did. They intended it for evil. God intended it for good.
I'm curious what other spots in scripture you kind of see this, that it's like there's suffering occurring, but it's not just that like God is causing this, kind of. So we're not just looking at one isolated passage. I'm wondering, Pastor Bob, if you can break down other spots in scripture where you think that happens as well.
Well, I can actually go to a spot where it is easy to read in as though God has caused all of this. And that's the famous passage in Romans 8, where it says, and we know that all things work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose. And we read causation into that passage. And that's not what it's saying. We know that in all of these things, God is able. I can walk with a kind of confidence that regardless of how bad it looks, God is able to redeem what I'm walking through and to bring something out that is not only brings honor and glory to him, but it's actually good for me. But I do think the human tendency is when things go right, we give ourselves credit. When things go wrong, we blame God. And it's always God's fault. Even in the insurance claims, it's an act of God. If lightning strikes your house, oh, that was a God thing. What are you going to do? I think the human tendency is to blame God for bad and to take credit when it's good.
Yeah, I think that the whole Bible really adds up to that point as well, that God seems to give human beings this choice as to whether or not we are going to serve and love and follow him or not. And he makes it pretty clear that if you listen to my voice, listen to my wisdom, then you're going to experience fruitful and abundant life. But if you don't, it's going to lead towards pain and destruction. And for whatever reason, he gives human beings the ability to make that choice, knowing that it's going to cause this pain and destruction in people's lives. And so when we see something that is not right in the world, I think it is appropriate from a biblical perspective to say, that's not right. That's not how it should be. It's not how God intended it to be. That doesn't mean that God is any less powerful or any less in control. It just means that God has given us the ability to choose whether we're going to follow him or not. And so it's okay to say that thing that happened is not a good thing. That's not right. It's not how God intended it to be.
So, Stephen, how would you say, what's the difference between God causing pain and God using the pain and the suffering in our lives? Is there really a difference there?
I think there has to be a big difference in that. Like, if God were causing the pain and causing it, that would give me a very different moral depiction of who God is. That if he was the bringer of evil, if he was the bringer of destruction, that gives me a very different picture of who God is. That's not the God that we see portrayed in Scripture, that he doesn't bring evil. He doesn't bring destruction upon people. So I think it's a big difference that the enemy has worked in a way that has convinced humanity to operate in ways that's destructive. And we see and experience that all around us. But because that is happening, that doesn't limit God's ability to do something good in the middle of that. And I think that's why it's so powerful that God is still able to do and work something inside of this evil. But that doesn't mean that God caused it. So this is a big difference. It changes how we view God.
Yeah, I think that there are some people who believe that the ends justifies the means, and as long as something good comes out of it, then it's okay. I think we all struggle with being on the receiving end of that. The ends does not justify the means. Secondly, I also think that if we develop an idea, well, because God did it, it's different, because as though God's standards for himself are lower than they are for us. When anybody says, I can do this because of the position I hold, we consider that a form of corruption. We don't think that that's good. Why would we ascribe to God goodness when he actually, if he was lowering his standards and causing pain and all of these things because something good would come out of it? I don't think it makes a lot of sense when we view it through that lens.
Well, you even think of the implications of what that means. If you were to follow that way of thinking through, you have somebody, a family who loses a child. Like, are you really going to sit there and say that God caused that to happen? That God would want that to happen just so some cool secret good could come out of it later? And you just tell that to a parent, and you know that is not how God intended it. This is, God chooses life for people. Death and destruction He doesn't operate in that way. So when you follow that way of thinking out, you can get to really distorted views of who God is. And to what Pastor Bob said, like, well, the ends justify the means. Like, really? Like, that's the depiction of God that we want, this moral fluidity to choose that, well, I can do something bad and evil even if it means that something good can come out of it. That doesn't seem like how God depicts himself in Scripture. And in fact, the characters in the Bible who operate in that way often are judged pretty harshly.
Well, that's why I think I'm so grateful that we get the imagery and the vision of Genesis 1 and 2 of what the original garden, what God originally intended for this to be like and to look like. And of course, the fall happens and everything gets broken, but we get to see that, like, the way that God intended was not where we're at right now. Sin messed everything up. And now we live in the midst of all this brokenness. And so I think that's crucial too, is to understand how God intended it. And then God's intentions over time is that all would be made right again, that every tear would be wiped from our eye. Like that, Jesus is going to come back again and make all the wrong things right. And I think that is key. But that's a very different view of God than he's going around and he's causing suffering in his creation. But you know what? There's somebody got saved through it. So it's all good. And that's just different.
And I think one of the reasons why people head in this direction and we start making our theology look this way is because I think it terrifies us of the idea that God might not be completely in control. And I think that's what they assume, is that if this bad thing is happening, that means God's not in control, and that's not God. So because he's in control, that also means that he causes all of these things. And we've taken a leap and bounds somewhere that we shouldn't. So we can both simultaneously believe that God is sovereign, that his plan is orchestrating something in our world, using the evil for good, so that his plan can come to fruition in the end of time. At the same time, we can hold that and know that doesn't mean that God's causing pain and evil. He's not utilizing this for his own purposes, that he can bring purpose out of it, but it is not his tool. And so we have to be able to separate those two things. We can't allow our fear, like, wait, does that mean God's not in control, to move us down a way of thinking about God that's not how he portrays himself.
Yeah. So I'm wondering for the Christian who is either trying to walk with somebody else who's in deep pain and suffering, or whether they're going through it themselves. Like, I'm wondering, like, what do we say to those kinds of people? Because you bring up okay, somebody goes through the hardest of hard situations. Your spouse dies of cancer way too young. It's like, well, God will work this out for good, is like, that is so insensitive and horrible, right? To say to somebody in that moment. But yeah, God could bring some good out of that too. But what do we say? Because I think sometimes we get stuck in those moments of, I don't know what to say. I don't know how to say it. So let me try to spiritualize this. And I don't think any of us try to walk in trying to over-spiritualize it. We're trying to find comfort. But I think sometimes when we're trying to find comfort, we can actually find words that actually are really hurtful to somebody. So then I feel like the fear is like, well, I just won't say anything. And then I draw away from those people because it's uncomfortable to especially sitting with somebody who's deeply grieving. And yet I think our call is to draw closer to those who are hurting. That's what God does. So Pastor Bob, what do you make of all of that? What would you say to somebody who's sitting in just some deep pain?
I don't think we should try to say more than God does. I think that's where we always get into a lot of trouble. And when God is with them in the pain that they're in, God does draw near to the brokenhearted. He is not absent when they're going through all of this incredible torment and trauma in their life. Like he hasn't abandoned them or left them, but he's not saying things to them to make light of it either. And so when we come along and we try to fill that gap, we wind up not doing a very good job. Right? If God didn't say it, don't say it. I mean, don't try to make something up to fill in the awkwardness that you have because God is not speaking something in this situation. You can be with a person without trying to make light of it. And this is the challenge for us. How do I encourage a person in the pain they're going through without making light of the pain they're going through? And anytime a person feels like you're making light of it, the great expression is, well, everything happens for a reason. Why don't we just say everything happens? In our world, it does. The good news is we're not left alone in it, and God is at work in the midst of it, and He's going to get us through it. Like all those things are true. But that doesn't mean that He's got a hidden agenda behind all of this that was all part of His plan.
I think one of the reasons that people will quickly jump to that, even that phrase of, everything happens for a purpose or a reason, or God's trying to teach you something in this, is again, we feel like God is orchestrating this in some way because it feels like, well, what other reason could there be? Like if this is happening, this is so drastic, this is so severe, there must be a reason for it. God must have something up His sleeve here. And I do think it's okay to just simply grieve the bad thing that's happened, to admit and to even pray it back to God that what happened to you is not right. It is not good, period. End there. It is not good. Grieve it. And I think that's the most healthy spiritual thing that you can do is to start there. And then eventually you can find that God will and can bring good things out of that. But it doesn't mean that He has caused that to teach you some kind of lesson. So sit and grieve it. And in context of the question you asked, like if you have somebody who is dealing with this, I would highly advise like not using language of, well, God's doing this for a purpose. You know that, right? Or maybe you should find whatever God's doing in this. And I think just simply sit and grieve the fact that something awful and terrible has happened. And eventually, God will start to show something good that can come out of this. But so it sounds like I'm splitting hairs here, but I think it's really important. Otherwise, we'll get a misconceived idea of who God is, and we'll assume He's just this puppet master pulling strings for His own entertainment kind of thing.
Grieve with those who grieve.
Sure.
Right. And I think that that's such an important message. And I think there's power when we are together and when we're supporting those who are really hurting. I think God can use us to help each other. Like that's part of the huge value of community. And we don't have to have all the most profound things, and you don't have to know all the scriptures. Like I think a lot of times God can just use your presence to help somebody when they're down and out. And I think even for ourselves when we're going through it, the tendency for many of us can be to withdraw from community. Like I think that's kind of the natural tendency. But I think there can be some real power and healing that happens when you're around people who really love and care deeply about you. And I think that can help with your healing.
Yeah, I'd like to tie in. So I just made a comment regarding, not saying something that God is not saying. And in a way that's kind of taking the place of God, right? There's another way that Joseph actually says he will not take the place of God. And that has to do with the punishment of his brothers. They're pretty sure they're going to receive punishment now that their father's dead. Their assumption is Joseph has just been holding back, that the real protection has been from their father Jacob. And Joseph says, this winds up being a theology that you see embedded into the Psalms and throughout the rest of Scripture. He says, I'm not in the place of God. Now, he was in a position where he could punish them if he wanted to. He had the authority and the power to do that, but he chose not to. He said, I'm not in the place of God. And in a sense, that unwillingness to take his place, because how easy would it be for him to say, you know what, God put me in this place for this moment and for this time, and now judgment is coming. But that's not what he says. I'm not in the place of God. And what he does is by refusing to take the place of God, it's a form of worship because he allows God to still be God. Anytime we're trying to take the place, fill in the gaps, be something that God has not said or has not done, then we're actually putting ourselves in the place of God. And this is not a good place. We don't want to be there. And this follows through all the rest of Scripture. How much of the identity of Judaism and of Christianity goes all the way back to this, It's not my role to act as the judge in this situation. I'm going to let God handle this. But this is what he did say. God has put me in this place, but not for judgment. God has put me in this place for the saving of many lives. And the famine is still going on. People are starving, but the storehouses of Egypt are full, and many lives are being saved as a result. If you want to put yourself where you feel like you're in the place God put you, think of it in terms of saving lives. If it's judgment or if it's condemnation, God didn't ask you to do that.
I also think that one of the reasons that people will too quickly go to, well, this must have happened for a reason, is because we're trying to avoid some kind of pain. That if we can't cope with the idea that the suffering that we have is actually meaningless. We can't cope with the idea that the suffering we have is actually not how God intended. And so in order to avoid that pain, we will attempt to find a reason for it, to find a purpose, to say, oh, okay, well, this must have happened for a reason. So really, I shouldn't grieve as hard as I'm grieving, or I shouldn't feel this pain in the way that I am because I'm so focused on finding a purpose. And I think there's something to be missed in our grieving process. There's something that can't be healed if we don't recognize that what happened is actually poor, that is not good, not the way that God intended. So it can be a pain avoidance mechanism to say, oh, well, God's just trying to teach me something. So therefore, take Paul out of context, I should rejoice in my suffering, actually. And I think that we're twisting scripture. I think the Psalms would tell us, now, if you've experienced something that feels meaningless, to declare that back to God and say, this isn't right, God. I don't know why this is happening. And God meets you there. And that is the power of grief and suffering, is that when you operate out of that actual honesty and vulnerability, that God meets you in those moments. And then that is when the good starts to come out of the suffering. It's not the suffering itself. It's the interaction with God in the middle of it where good starts to come into place.
That's good. And I think God gave us emotions, like God gave us even grief. And of course, none of us want to stay in that place or feel those feelings. And yet, I think that it's part of our natural body's response to some horrible things that can happen in our lives. And so I think it actually is a gift from God to help us heal, and how he's even created our bodies and our minds and our spirits all connected. And so, yeah, I appreciate this conversation from you guys, the insights you guys have shared, so that we can understand it's not just God going around causing suffering all over the world, but God is bringing about redemption, even through the darkest individual moments we go through broad things. Like he can do so much good out of horrible things, but also the call for us as humans is to grieve when it's time to grieve. And for us not to, like you're kind of saying, not to rush through that process. Sometimes we need to sit in it and acknowledge it. And I think it is when we are in that place that God comes and meets us. So thank you guys for your sharing and your insights. Thank you guys for tuning in. I hope this has encouraged your heart and your soul. If you are going through it right now, there is a God who is going through it with you, and he loves you deeply. Thank you so much for joining us. Hope to see you again next time.